It's an architectural icon recognized in every nation on every continent. It rose from the ashes of 2 catastrophic wars. It stands as a symbol of hope, that a union of nations can come together in one place to make peace. 60 years ago, the founders of the United Nations would have to assemble a team of world-renowned architects. Their goal? To design a headquarters that would express the vision of a future without war.
Don't forget, these people really thought that they were building something that would ensure world peace. Having just come out of the war, that was a tremendous idea.
That was in the days when architecture was done with paper and pencil and not with computers.
Because it is the only building built by a committee that I know of which is actually a rising success in its own right.
When you're dealing with an architect who is not simply an employee, but a representative of a member state of serious consequence, Russia, France, Brazil, it's a different story. The architect has independent muscle.
They were all absolutely the same level as rock stars, have become. They were big time.
And I feel that we have built not a symbol of peace, but a workshop for peace.
"11 giants of architecture from 11 different nations were asked to come together and design a complex of buildings where the work of peace would take place. Brilliant men, each regarded as his country's finest and used to running things his own way, would have to find a way to work with each other's ideas and egos. To find a common ground and create something together, better than one could alone. It was the same challenge that would face the United Nations itself.
Going back to the climate of the time, it was right after the war. There was tremendous optimism. There was tremendous elation at the overthrow of this dreadful regime in Germany, and America and the West had accomplished at the time. I mean, it was a time of euphoria.
The groundwork began in 1945 in San Francisco, California, where the charter for the fledgling United Nations was written in 9 short weeks. It would be a blueprint, a guide for humanity to ensure the peaceful future of the planet.
And nobody really knew exactly how it would come into being. They knew that the League of Nations, which had preceded it, had been a disaster, but they figured this one would be different because of the way it was constructed. So there's a tremendous enthusiasm, but moderated with a certain skepticism about how it all work out.
46 delegations arrived in San Francisco, representing 80% of the world's population. The stakes were high, for this was nothing less than a universal outpouring of hope, an experiment of unprecedented importance.
The loss of 90 million people within 3 decades was so devastating and so crippling to the idea of the future of the human species that the delegates really felt they had to do something in San Francisco to prevent the outbreak of a Third World War. And yes, there was this feeling that if you could put together an international security organization based on the philosophy of collective security, that yes, war could be prevented.
The American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, wanted the basic concepts of American democracy, human rights, equality, economic opportunity, and political freedom to form the basis of the new UN Charter.
Roosevelt very sadly died 13 days before the UN conference opened. It was a great blow to all the people who were working to make the UN successful, because Roosevelt was the leader, the man who had brought in Churchill and Stalin and all these other countries to agree on remaking the League of Nations into a United Nations.
Roosevelt's successor, Harry S. Truman, was unknown on the international stage. He had been abroad only once in his life as a soldier in World War I, but his belief in the possibilities of the UN was unshakable, and he lent the full weight of his presidency to it.
Were many who doubted that agreement could ever be reached by these 50 countries, differing so much in race and religion, in language and culture. But these differences were all forgotten in one unshakable unity of determination to find a way to end war.
The final draft of the UN Charter was signed by 50 countries on June 26, 1945. The precious document, wrapped in its own parachute, was flown to Washington, D.C. for safekeeping in Truman's White House. It would have to wait for the UN to be built before reaching its final destination.
The first UN conference, basically the conference that opened the UN, was held in London because at that time the UN had no set headquarters as it does today in New York.
And it was very exciting. I mean, we started from absolutely nothing. We all moved furniture, swept floors, received foreign ministers, wrote all the documents and everything. It was a very small staff working very hard. It was fun. And it was very exciting because it was an organization which people passionately believed in. After all, everybody had been in a world war for 6 years. And to have this kind of wonderful idea growing up there, it was like a sort of light in the darkness. It was a fantastic period.
But not every country liked the idea of meeting in London. Already, there was dissension among the participating nations.
Question is, where is the UN going to be? And the first thing that's settled very early on in 1945 in London is that it's not going to be in Europe. Geneva had been a serious contender. It had been the headquarters of the League of Nations. There were a lot of Europeans who thought they were the center of the world, and they wanted the center of the world to be there. But a lot of people didn't.
We had come to the United States largely because the Soviet Union refused to have the organization back in Geneva, Switzerland again. They had been expelled from the League of Nations, and they'd never forgotten it, and they just weren't going to go back to Geneva. And of course, all the non-European countries rather liked the idea of being in the United States, and the Soviet Union wanted the UN to be in the United States, so the United States couldn't get out of the organization that it had done with the League of Nations. And so that's how we got here, but nobody knew where on earth we were going to go.
San Francisco was the early favorite because that had been where the founding operation was, and it was a lovely city, and the feds were going to give the Presidios a place to camp out in. You know, what's not to like? Well, from the Russian perspective, everything. The Russians say, too far. What do you mean too far? Vladivostok, San Francisco, they're right next door. Vladivostok? Niet. The Soviet Union is a European power. Moscow is the capital, and the East Coast is 3,000 miles closer than is the Presidio. Well, New York City is an obvious choice, and in fact, the city is extremely proactive in trying to get it.
We had this temporary lodging in New York City, and we were all over the place. There were offices in Rockefeller Center. We were in the Sperry Gyroscope bomb factory in Lake Success, Long Island. The Security Council met in what is now called Lehman College in the Bronx. The Assembly met in the ice skating rink at the World Fair site in Flushing Meadows. We spent most of the time dashing about in motor cars and getting speeding tickets.
Then, Robert Moses offered the grounds of the 1939 World's Fair in Flushing Meadow. His biographer wrote, "Where other men might see the formation of the United Nations as a chance for lasting peace, Moses saw a chance for a park with a domed assembly chamber on the shores of a man-made lagoon."
The problem was that the delegates didn't like it out there. It was not a happy area. They had to commute back and forth from the city. There were traffic jams. It was a nuisance. Niet from the UN, New York. And there's no other site at that point in time. This committee that's choosing this sets the end of December 46 as the date, and there's been an awful lot of toing and froing, and they're getting really nervous. They want to settle this deal. And Philadelphia emerges as the likely candidate, compromise city. There are people who are not too crazy about it because it's too near Washington, the major capital. But it looks like it's going to happen, and then at the last second, there's a dramatic turn of events.
A monumental real estate project called X-City was being planned for an 18-acre tract of land between 42nd Street and 48th Street along the East River. It would include an opera house, concert hall, luxury apartments, even a futuristic heliport. The man behind X-City was the larger-than-life real estate mogul, William Zeckendorf.
He is going to do nothing less than create a rival to Rockefeller Center. He's sitting at home with his wife, reading the New York Times, reading that, in fact, the General Assembly Committee is going to make a decision, immediately, and they're almost certainly going to go to Philadelphia unless something else happens, and he says,
Zeckendorf had a secret. He couldn't afford to pay for X-City. So he came up with an ingenious scheme that would rid him of the unwieldy project by offering to sell the land to the UN. To pay for it, Trygve Lie, the first Secretary General of the UN, approached the Rockefeller family for the $8.5 million needed to seal the deal. The gift allowed them to appear magnanimous while eliminating a project that would have been a powerful rival to Rockefeller Center.
A small delegation seeked Zeckendorf out at where he's carousing in his favorite spot, the Monte Carlo. And they sit down and they hammer it out right on the table, drawing on a napkin and a map. Oh, let's see, 42nd Street, 48th Street, signature, done.
Trygve Lie had learned to negotiate the intricacies of the rough-and-tumble New York real estate world. He predicted that by placing the UN in New York, the city would become the capital of the world.
I take both pride and pleasure in accepting the gift of property which New York City is today transferring to the United Nations for its world capital. Of every color, race, and creed have demonstrated their ability to live and work together in peace and understanding.
The tract of land Zeckendorf sold to the UN was priced far below market value, for good reason. It was home to various meatpacking plants.
And the place stank to high heaven. It was so bad that when they built Tudor City in the 20s, they had to brick over the area facing the river because the stench was overpowerful. And it was called Blood Alley. I mean, it was bad.
Yes, that was when the slaughterhouses were here, and First Avenue was paved with cobblestones. They would bring the cattle in on barges along the East River, and the river would run red with blood as they slaughtered the animals.
On March 26, 1947, the Swift and the Wilson meatpacking companies and the United Nations reached a final agreement. The site was purchased and demolition began.
And it all came together. And I think that Trygve Lie deserves a great deal of credit for that, because he had the right idea. He didn't want the UN to be sequestered in some idyllic sort of rural utopia somewhere where it would simply be a completely unreal atmosphere. He wanted it to be right in the middle of a great city with all of the gritty stimulus that gives to a political organization. And I think he was right.
The delegates wanted to be right in the city, near the restaurants and night spots and so forth. After all, they all came, many of them, from war-ravaged Europe, and they were happy to be in New York. They loved every moment of it. When we moved down to the building, the corner of 42nd and First Avenue, you could look out the window and see the demolition of the buildings with the big steel ball going back and forth and the dust rising in the air. And as I look at it each day, it brings back memories of a happy time and interesting work. My time there was very exciting right after the war, and we felt that this was the beginning of a whole new experience in the architectural field.
11 of the most prominent architects from around the world were charged with coming together to turn Blood Alley into a working symbol of peace. They were given only 3 months to do it. The group included Sven Markelius from Sweden, the proud combative Le Corbusier representing France, Dr. Liang Shu Cheng bringing the traditions of China, the avant-garde young Brazilian Oscar Niemeyer, the Australian Gilles A. Saulieu, the pragmatic Soviet engineer Nikolai Basov, and the Canadian Ernest Cormier. At the head of this talented, volatile group was the American architect Wallace K. Harrison. Courtly in his manner, with firm beliefs of his own, he had studied architecture in Paris. There, he developed an admiration for the revolutionary master of modern architecture, Le Corbusier. Back in New York, Harrison joined the team responsible for the design of Rockefeller Center and then designed the famous Trilon and Perisphere that became the symbol of the 1939 World's Fair. During these years, he developed a close friendship with the UN's benefactor, the young Nelson Rockefeller.
He certainly was the prime person in terms of choosing the other architects. If I remember correctly, he had also named some of the German architects, like Mies van der Rohe, who of course was immediately ruled out because of the war, the fact that he was German. His role was really to stimulate the ideas of the others with his own knowledge and experience as an architect, to guide them, and just to keep peace and to keep people talking.
Well, Wally Harrison was a sort of miracle man, really, because he was an extremely successful architect who was also a very modest, very charming, very self-effacing, and extremely clever man. Everybody else submitted a plan. He was the one architect who didn't. He simply looked at all the plans and decided how they would try to get the best elements into one building.
When he worked on Rockefeller Center, he was beginning. He was still very much of a junior architect. I think he was very idealistic and hopeful, and I think probably his disillusion with large projects came later. Came in part because of the United Nations. I mean, when he was invited to do the same kind of job at Lincoln Center, I remember him talking to me and saying, oh my goodness, I thought, oh no, not again. I don't want to have to go through that again.
Though he respected each of the architects, Harrison was worried about how the group would interact. He was especially wary of working with Le Corbusier, who was well known for his uncompromising views.
One of the most intriguing players in the next round, what's it going to look like now that we know where it's going to be, is Corbusier. And Corbusier is fascinating because, in fact, he had been promoting for a long time now visions of the radiant city, the vertical city, densely concentrated urban affairs.
Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, known to the world as Le Corbusier, was born in Switzerland in 1887. One of the great visionaries of 20th century architecture, he considered himself not just an architect, but a utopian planner. He envisioned vast futuristic cities where networks of incandescent towers would house citizens in the sky bathed in light. When he was called to New York, he wanted to see these ideas applied to the design of the UN.
Then, of course, Corbusier felt that he should be the one who should be in charge of the UN. And I believe that he at one point set himself up as the master planner with Bassoff and Niemeyer and a couple of others to work under him. And he wanted to assign Harrison to be sort of the liaison with the city and handle the details and the politics and so forth, while he, Corbusier, was in charge of the great design. Well, of course, Harrison would have none of that because Harrison was in charge. And Harrison had to have a great deal of forbearance in not blowing his top with Corbusier.
He was a rather scholarly-looking man who expressed extremely strong and interesting opinions. And he had good reason to, because he had won the prize to build the League of Nations building in Geneva. Canton of Geneva were horrified at this beautiful modern building that was going to go up on the side of the lake, and they in some way managed to shift the ground rules so that he was disqualified, and then they built this monstrosity which is there today, the Palais des Nations, the European headquarters of the UN.
So Harrison, I think, in his wonderfully gentlemanly way, felt that by inviting him, not only would he have a fine architect, but also that it might make up, in part, for that past history.
Well, he probably regretted it at the time, yes. As a matter of fact, all of the time.
Wally Harrison is very important. Not only he had experience on the only sort of massive assemblage of skyscrapers ever built in Rockefeller Center, and not only did he have the ear of the Rockefeller family, which was not inconsequential, but he was a negotiator. He was a broker. He was an accommodator. He was able to arrange, consensus. And this was going to be a multicultural, multi-architectural enterprise, the likes of which had not been seen in New York.
The mandate was huge. The charge was threefold. First, to design an assembly hall, or general assembly, where all the member nations would meet as equals. Second, a series of smaller meeting rooms or council chambers were required, where the specific work could be hammered out in areas that included security, economics, and social welfare. And finally, a building to house the large behind-the-scenes administrative staff called the Secretariat. Harrison addressed the team.
Well, it's a great honor to have you here with us in New York. Most of us here haven't had the experiences that you've had during the war. We hope that out of your trials and tribulations, you may be able to find a method to help us produce something that will be a symbol for peace and security, and particularly of the United Nations in the future. I don't know anything else we ought to do. Let's go to work.
From the first meeting, it was clear this was not going to be an easy project. Harrison began.
We'll be working against a tough schedule. Preliminary drawings are due the 1st of July. We have a big job ahead of us, one of the most important for any architect in the history of the world.
Le Corbusier raised his hand immediately, trying to steer the project to his own vision.
All Manhattan is our concern,
he said. The city grid, the change of grade, the site's topography. The office tower should be a colossal structure in a park, an immense space for the joie de vivre.
He thought of himself as the greatest architect in the world, probably not unlike Frank Lloyd Wright. He was the person who knew everything.
Nikolai D. Basov was one of Russia's most prized architects and a hero of World War II. He had directed the colossal task of moving Russian factories across the Ural Mountains ahead of the conquering German army, and was unafraid of taking on Le Corbusier.
It was always alleged, rightly or wrongly, that Basov was an expert on foundations, because the Soviets, if you remember, had this rather unfortunate experience with these very high buildings they built in Moscow, which sank regularly about 6 inches every year until what had been the first floor was actually the basement after a bit.
Basov was the first to address the placement of all the buildings together.
The best plan may be to place the Secretariat Tower at the north end of the site,
he said.
The 3 council rooms connected to it along the river, and the General Assembly in the middle.
Next to speak was Dr. Liang Shu Cheng, who favored traditional Chinese design with low-level buildings surrounding courtyards and gardens. When named to the design team, he had been teaching at Yale, invited there by another professor, Wallace K. Harrison. Dr. Liang explained his views on the project.
We should place the tower to gain maximum sunshine in winter. The long side of the tower should face south.
Throughout this meeting, Le Corbusier had been pacing restlessly. The group process was strange to him, and he wanted to bring the meeting to a close. Resolved to make a tall tower the centerpiece of the entire design, he quickly sketched out his idea.
The height of the Secretariat was very, very important, and that was the thing that was the main draw for most of the architects, according to Harrison, that America symbolized high-rise buildings, which were not as prevalent then as they are today, and certainly not in that form, glass and steel. This was really one of the first almost complete glass and steel buildings. So that, as something totally novel, totally an invention of the time, was meant to represent this new idea.
Harrison met the Brazilian Oscar Niemeyer at the 1939 World's Fair, where he had designed his country's pavilion. He later became known internationally as the architect of Brasilia, the modernistic capital of Brazil. The youngest member of the team, Niemeyer was felt by many to be one of the most original architectural talents of his generation. Senator Warren Austin tried to block Niemeyer's entry into the United States because of his communist views. Trygve Lie intervened, saying, "This is an international organization."
Niemeyer was, as I remember, very cooperative and easy to work with and so forth, but as long as Corbusier was around, Niemeyer more or less was in the background.
Evidently, Niemeyer is also very sensitive to the cold, and he didn't want to come out of his hotel room in winter. I mean, he was very, very, reluctant to face the cold.
Quando eu cheguei em Nova York, o Corbusier me procurou. E no primeiro dia me encontrei com ele na Quinta Avenida e ele me levou para a casa do amigo dele para conversar. Ele queria me convencer, me pedir para ajudar no projeto dele, que estava sendo criticado. O projeto dele previa, tinha o terreno da ONU, ele botava a grande assembleia no centro do terreno, não é? E tinha prédio alto do lado. Então eu não gostava muito do projeto, que dividia o terreno em dois.
His serious reservations about Le Corbusier's plan, Niemeyer was the great architect's disciple and felt obligated to remain silent for the time being. Harrison learned that Le Corbusier was needed in his Paris office and would have to temporarily return to France. The question of the Secretariat Tower's design would have to be addressed. One of the first to share his ideas on the high-rise Secretariat building was Howard Robertson, the eloquent architect from Great Britain. He was an old friend of Harrison's from the World's Fair. Harrison hoped that Robertson's gentlemanly manner would lend civility to the proceedings that seemed certain to boil over sooner or later. Robertson introduced an innovative idea. Perhaps the elevator banks of the tower could project outward, half inside, half outside, he said. That might allow for more efficient use of the space on the floors. Robertson's suggestion sparked an immediate response from Le Corbusier. To put the elevators outside is against any principles. And then, as if on cue, Niemeyer agreed. The idea of the unit housing the elevators protruding from the rectangle is bad architecture. The purer form is the straight rectangular slab. That's true, agreed Le Corbusier. I am convinced that we should have the purest possible form. Le Corbusier left for his Paris office at 10 o'clock the following morning. For most of the week, Niemeyer took no part in the work in the drafting room and participated sparingly in meetings. One of the backroom boys later recalled asking him when he would start drawing. Niemeyer said he didn't think he should, since the master was already developing a scheme.
Passou uma semana, o Arson procurou. Seu Oscar, você não veio aqui para ajudar o Corbusier. Você veio para fazer o seu projeto como os outros. Eu peço para você começar o trabalho. Eu falei com ele e ele me disse, você vai fazer a confusão.
With his mentor in France, Niemeyer finally began to sketch out a proposal of his own. It was called Scheme 17 and was radically different from Le Corbusier's concept. It pulled the three buildings apart, the General Assembly, the Council Chambers, and the Secretariat Tower, and created an open space between the edge of the city and the river. It was a decisive break from Le Corbusier's scheme and the beginning of Niemeyer's impact on the project. Niemeyer was finally ready to present his own ideas to the team. As he spoke, his voice reflected his enthusiasm. I have placed the meeting rooms along the East River, he said. That creates a better view of the entire site from the rest of the city. Harrison was intrigued with Niemeyer's first plan, but he voiced one reservation. The new idea of putting the council rooms on the river is good, but what about the General Assembly separated, as it is in your scheme, Oscar? Won't the circulation be difficult? Yes, Mr. Harrison, Niemeyer replied. But circulation, ventilation, entrance and exit, and so on, these are all factors that combine to make a plan. Circulation is only one of them. Harrison liked Niemeyer's design and looked around the room for approval. Gentlemen, do we agree on Scheme 17 in general? Nikolai Basov reserved judgment. I think the buildings are too far apart. We'll keep that in mind, Nikolai, Harrison said. But our timing is such that we must have the design ready by the end of May, only 10 weeks. Harrison was excited by Niemeyer's scheme and eager to proceed with it, but he knew Le Corbusier had a scheme of his own, which would have to be given serious consideration. When Le Corbusier returned, he brought Vladimir Bodiansky, a longtime colleague who would help reinforce his ideas. Le Corbusier envisioned a low, large block structure that would house every council and conference room and dominate the middle of the site. It was diametrically opposed to the openness of elements proposed by Niemeyer in his Scheme 17. The stage was set for a turbulent clash of ideas. Harrison spoke as if he were walking a tightrope.
Welcome back, Corbu. Reviewing all the schemes we've seen, we like Niemeyer's Scheme 17.
Le Corbusier's first reply was cold.
I have studied it, he said. But I thought we had already decided on my design for the Secretariat Tower and its relationship to the block. In Niemeyer's scheme, there is no low connecting block.
Harrison spoke quickly.
We all like 17.
And that was the match that ignited the fire. Le Corbusier stood up quickly.
What we miss is the beast itself. The whole block should be a form, pure and simple.
Silence followed, the room filled with tension. Finally, Harrison replied.
Of course, we haven't settled this yet, but we're at the end of March. Time is running out. Very well, agreed. I can see Niemeyer's scheme, Le Corbusier acknowledged. It only loses the feeling of the block.
He would save his fight for another day. Niemeyer was absent at the next meeting. He claimed to have a March cold, but many of the backroom boys thought he was upset by Le Corbusier's objections to his scheme. There were equally impressive ideas being sketched out by the other prominent architects, each with a distinctive point of view. Scheme 24, the proposal of Dr. Liangshu Chang from China, was built around an inward-looking courtyard shaded by the high-rise Secretariat Tower, which he had turned so that its thin side faced the river.
With an east-west orientation, the Secretariat building would get the maximum of both light and ventilation in New York. I believe this will not only make it more comfortable for the people working there, but will allow them to work more efficiently. And it will save a lot of money in the air conditioning equipment for the building itself.
He had said that in China, major buildings were east and west in their orientation. But of course, here, it's north and south. But he gave in on that.
Le Corbusier spoke up.
This is not a competition, he said. We work together. For 6 weeks, we studied the elements.
His voice got louder.
We want spectacle. We want unity. We want the Secretariat Tower to connect directly to the Assembly and the Council chambers in a block. They must be alone on one level, like this.
Unwilling to let go of Niemeyer's scheme, and unsure how to resolve all the differences, Harrison was at an impasse. He ended the meeting quickly.
We'll go over it again Monday with other schemes.
The team was presented with another innovative idea. There had been 28 distinctive schemes presented in 2 months. Number 29 was from Sven Markelius, an architect and city planner from Sweden. He had come to New York only a week before and brought himself up to date with astonishing speed, spending hours in the back room and sketching in his hotel deep into the night. When he presented his idea for the General Assembly, it was startling in its originality.
If the General Assembly has a special expressive shape, like a dome, it would stand out. It can therefore be very dominant,
Markelius said. Harrison was impressed with Markelius's design, but he had promised Le Corbusier and Bodiansky another chance to make a statement. Bodiansky began.
We have studied enough. Are we ready to make a decision on the final project?
Harrison was adamant. A final decision would be premature, but he allowed Bodiansky to continue.
We know what we want, Bodiansky said. The 29 schemes to date can be summed up in 2 categories. Those that group the General Assembly and all the councils and committees in a single block like ours, or dispersed across most of the site. It is our solution that is the most rational development from the functional point of view.
As Bodiansky finished, Harrison was beginning to think a workable compromise was impossible. When they walked into the room on Friday, the architects were greeted by 32 reporters, including photographers and writers from Life magazine. Harrison announced that, to no one's surprise, Le Corbusier had a statement. Happy to have center stage, Le Corbusier assured the reporters that the solidarity of the architects was absolute and that, under his guidance, the UN headquarters would be one of the world's modern wonders.
We are of different ages. Young men of the drawing office. They are masters and supervisors, we advisors and others. A wonderful result has been achieved, and one that is worth noting. We are all of the same opinion. Why are we so unanimous? Because after 100 years, the evolution of architecture has today reached decisive fruition. Each of us has given or will give his ideas. Each helps his neighbor. There are no competing plans. To those outside who question us, we can reply, we are united. We are a team, the world team of the United Nations, laying down the plans for a world architecture that will respect human, natural, and cosmic laws. There are no names attached to this work. Each of us can be legitimately proud of having been called upon to work on this team. Each one of us can give to Monsieur Harrison the assurance that we will all work anonymously.
Harrison praised the Frenchman.
That is touching, beautifully done. We'll do our best to reach an agreement in the next week or 10 days.
Niemeyer had been silent all week, but, emboldened by the reception his work had received, he had been hard at work revising his original Scheme 17. His new design was labeled 32.
The solution I have developed is to maintain the tall building required by the program, he said. Then the council rooms and the General Assembly building completely separated. Niemeyer went on. In this way, a huge plaza of the United Nations is created. This scheme would fulfill both the requirements of the project. It would be functional, and it would have the beauty of an esplanade on the river.
Todos os arquitetos se entusiasmaram pelo meu projeto. No dia seguinte, o Arson procurou e disse: Oscar, eles querem o seu projeto. Você aceita isso? Está bem. No dia seguinte, eles se reuniram. Foi aprovado com muito entusiasmo. Eles gostaram de ter feito blocos separados, ter separado o conceito da grande Assembleia, ter criado a praça.
Ten days had passed since Le Corbusier talked to the press. He had missed 2 meetings. Le Corbusier asked one of the backroom boys which was his favorite among all the different schemes. When he replied that it was Niemeyer's, Le Corbusier exclaimed, "How can you say that? He's just a young man. That scheme isn't from a mature architect." Unwilling to back down, Le Corbusier continued to press for his Scheme 23. The tension was rising. Standing before the room, Le Corbusier the theorist defended Le Corbusier the architect. Speaking largely in the third person, he said of himself,
Le Corbusier was sent by the French to defend the ideas of modern architecture, and is responsible to the world at large for A, indisputable function, and B, certain beauty. Scheme 23 was done with all present. It was discussed with all the designers and the UN people in a general meeting. I appeal for final unanimity to work together on the final formulation.
Harrison's reaction was cool and terse.
Thank you. Let's move on to other schemes.
But he sensed that the greatest crisis of the entire project was about to come. All of the architects knew a showdown between Le Corbusier and Niemeyer was imminent. Going up with Niemeyer on the elevator, Dr. Liang declared, "Today I am with you." Harrison addressed the group.
I must insist, as I did when I took the job, I must have full responsibility for the design. There can be a decision by a vote, or I can make a decision. I have explained the difficulty of a vote. After a vote, you have the winners and the losers. If I make the decision, I am the only loser.
Harrison pointed to the 14 schemes tacked to the wall.
In view of the difficulties and the time we have left, I conclude the only one of these that gives complete satisfaction is an early idea of Le Corbusier's, as carried out and drawn up by Oscar Niemeyer.
It was a brilliant diplomatic coup. By suggesting that Niemeyer's Scheme 32 was derived from Le Corbusier's iconic design of the freestanding tower, Harrison appealed to the Frenchman's vanity. The trick was to convince Le Corbusier that Niemeyer was, in fact, honoring his mentor's theories. All eyes turned to Le Corbusier.
I am very happy about what I have heard,
he said, surprising many in the room.
I agree that to vote is bad. We should give Monsieur Harrison the designation.
Contrary to appearances, Le Corbusier had in fact changed his tactics, but not his intentions. In the meetings, he would be very agreeable, but behind the scenes, he overwhelmed his young protege and convinced him to incorporate his own Scheme 23. In his notebook, Le Corbusier revealed his true feelings about the decision in two cartoon-like sketches. The first, a nude gracefully at rest leaning on her elbow, he marked number 23, his plan. The second shows the body violently dismembered, the decapitated torso floating unsupported, the severed legs akimbo. This he marked number 32, Niemeyer's plan.
Ele pediu para botar a Assembleia no centro do terreno. Eu não devia ter aceito, porque eu estava ocupando a Praça das Nações Unidas. Mas ele era mais velho, ele era o mestre, eu era jovem e eu concordei. Então meu projeto, que era o projeto 32, virou o projeto 32-23, que era o dele.
The compromise between Le Corbusier and Niemeyer's plans was officially presented to the group. Many raised objections, including Ernest Cormier, the delegate from Canada, who was upset with the attempt to reject Niemeyer's open plaza.
I don't like 2332 splitting up the area of the site, he said. Niemeyer's Scheme 32 kept the open spaces a beautiful plaza.
But Niemeyer knew it was too late. The compromise was in place.
Ele tinha aquela preocupação em todos os estudos dele de botar a praça da Grande Assembleia no centro do terreno. Foi fazer um projeto que infelizmente foi desfigurado e que tem lá hoje é um prédio grudado no outro, que foi muito ruim para o pé da nação. Tinham todo o empenho, mas eu com essa coisa do arquiteto mais jovem que acredita no outro, eu não devia ter aceito a modificação. O prédio das Nações Unidas era um projeto muito bom, foi uma pena. Se fosse hoje, eu não aceitava a sugestão do Corbusier. Eu dizia, não, minha solução é essa.
Scheme 2332 was refined and adjusted and was renamed 42. The end was in sight, or so Harrison thought. Over the last weekend, two teams made final efforts to promote their own plans, delaying the final decision. The first team of Robertson, Cormier, and the Greek architect John Antoniadis called for an enclosed site shut off from the rest of the city. The second plan, developed by Le Corbusier, Niemeyer, Bodiansky, and the Yugoslav Ernest Weissman, went the opposite way, calling for even more openness. Finally, Harrison had to put his foot down.
I didn't want this job if we were going to have a fight, he said. I see we can't have too many cooks. We have all done our best on 40-plus sets of plans. I'll say 42 is the point to which I have come, and those who want to can come along with me.
It's more Wally Harrison's building than anybody's, you know. Well, you couldn't get a team of painters to paint a painting, for instance, or a team of sculptors to do a sculpture. You know. So somebody has to be in the lead. It has to be somebody's idea. It has to be somebody's concept. But there's no doubt that Corbu and Niemeyer produced the concept. I think they were certainly the strongest, most egocentric of all of that group of architects.
Gentlemen, we have now arrived at Plan 42G. 42G has the Secretariat to the south, the General Assembly to the north, the various council chambers here on the river. The Secretariat Court comes closest to 42nd Street, which will be the general access to the property for the working populace in the Secretariat.
What Harrison managed to get them to present was something quite extraordinary, because it is the only building built by a committee that I know of which is actually a rising success in its own right. It is a wonderfully sort of unified concept of a building. It's remarkable.
Historically, it was the first time that a truly monumental building had been done anywhere in the world in the real modernist vernacular. And we're just so fortunate that the right people were in the right place, as tough as it was for them to come to consensus.
Gentlemen, it has been extremely difficult for us to reach a common agreement on this plan. But the cooperation on the part of every one of you has been most wonderful. We have all felt our responsibility to the United Nations.
Harrison called it a workshop for peace because he felt the UN was not an institution so much as a process, as an ongoing process, a living process.
Well, inasmuch as the whole world was interested in the UN at that time and looked forward to it being the savior of mankind, more or less, to be involved in the building of it was very exciting. And everyone whom you would meet would tell me about what you're doing, what's it going to look like, and it must be marvelous to be working on it.
Secretary General Trygve Lie signed a series of contracts, and construction began on the site for the permanent headquarters of the United Nations.
In spring of '49, I decided to come and try to get a job at the United Nations because I really felt passionately that was the future, that was the hope for the future. And after a month or so, they put me on a drafting table. I was very fortunate because the site was where the library is. So you had a view over the construction site. By the time I got there, all of the major architects had left. Nevertheless, there was a footprint of all of those people, and it was pretty exciting to be in the general area where they all had been working on this wonderful project.
On October 24th, 1949, Wallace K. Harrison and Trygve Lie prepared to lay the cornerstone for the United Nations. 4 years after the UN Charter was first signed, people from all over America and the world converged on New York City. As the unfinished Secretariat Tower loomed above him, President Harry Truman, the man who had helped to champion the creation of the UN, stepped onto the dais to open the ceremony.
The President of the United States.
Truman, I think, was so deeply committed to this idea that the only way the planet could be assured of peace in the future was to bring all the states of the globe together. And I'm sure when he saw the cornerstone being laid for the UN building, he must have been deeply, deeply moved.
Truman's speech was delivered to an outdoor meeting of the UN General Assembly.
The 237th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is now in session.
We have come together today to lay the cornerstone of the permanent headquarters of the United Nations. These are the most important buildings in the world, for they are the center of man's hope for peace and a better life. This is the place where the nations of the world will work together to make that hope a reality. The laying of this cornerstone is an act of faith, our unshakable faith that the United Nations will succeed in accomplishing the great tasks for which it was created. We must make our devotion to the ideals of the Charter as strong as the steel in this building. We must pursue the objectives of the Charter with resolution as firm as the rock on which this building rests. We must conduct our affairs foursquare with the Charter in terms as true as this cornerstone. If we do these things, the United Nations will endure and will bring the blessings of peace and well-being to all mankind.
For Harrison, the long and difficult months of design and debate had led to this moment.
Beside me is Wallace Harrison, the Director of Planning, whose genius is responsible for so much. In the name of the peoples of the United Nations, I now place for deposit in the cornerstone to be preserved for all time an exact copy of the original charter signed at San Francisco. Mr. President, the cornerstone will now be lowered into place.
Harrison had faced temper tantrums and explosions of ego. He had sublimated his own ideas to encourage collaboration. Now, as the cornerstone of the United Nations dropped into place, he hoped that the success of the architects, the result of teamwork and cooperation, would be one of many examples of what could be achieved in the new headquarters of the United Nations.
And I never thought it would be the complete answer. It was going to be an experiment which would gradually fail and succeed and fail and succeed and move forward. And if, as long as everybody felt that it was an essential part of the world, it would inexorably carry on. And I still think that. I mean, I don't think, it took 250 years to build the United States government. It took 600 years to build the British governmental system. Why would a world organization spring perfectly into form in 60 years? I don't think it will. It's an experiment.
For 6 decades, the world's leaders have come to the United Nations to struggle with issues of war and peace. They have seen consensus and conflict,
Let me finish. You are saying lions here.
triumphs and disappointments,
And we shall treat it as such.
compromise and confrontation.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
They come from 191 nations, from every corner of the earth. Their quest for peace may seem elusive, but not impossible. In the words of Wallace K. Harrison, man has endeavored to build both better buildings and better worlds, and he has almost always failed because of individual differences. The world hopes for a symbol of peace. We have given them a workshop for peace.